A normal day, sometime in February, here in the MSF hospital in the northeast of Syria, in the region of Idlib. In the operating theatre, a surgeon is operating on a young man to remove a shell splinter from his neck. Once his wound has been cleaned, the surgical team will change the dressings on a child with severe burns.
He was carrying a gallon of fuel. He tried to pour some fuel in the fire. Suddenly, the can exploded.
There is no good quality fuel to be had, only home refined petrol, which is causing frequent accidents among the civilian population. Since the winter, the team has treated an average of 1 burns victim every 2 days. The hospital opened a year ago. Since then, more than 1,300 surgical interventions have been carried out.
When it first opened, the hospital was only 15 to 20 kilometers from the front line, and so we were seeing large numbers of wounded arriving regularly and frequently. Since then, the situation has developed, and the front line is now quite a long way away from the hospital and the village where we're working.
Closer to the front, MSF is providing direct support, mainly training, in 2 medical posts. In these facilities, the handful of Syrians are still providing medical care in the utmost secrecy, as many hospitals have been destroyed by government artillery fire. Here, we're in the basement of a building in the Idlib region.
The personnel are not medical or paramedical. There are 2 dentists working in this medical post, but the others are non-medical volunteers who have been teaching themselves and receiving training in medical care for the last 2 years. So there's emergency care activity. The patients, the wounded, are stabilized and then referred to a hospital. So there's a bit of everything going on here, as there are no other facilities in the vicinity providing medical services of any kind.
MSF is also supplying 19 healthcare facilities in the north of the country with medicines and medical material. Day after day, the Syrians working here are exposed to the horrors of the war.
Last October, a plane flew over and bombed a building. There were 42 children inside. 4 or 5 families were living in this building at the time. When we arrived, all 42 children were dead, boys and girls. We tried to take them to the field hospital where we work. It was the most horrific sight.
The extreme violence of the conflict is also causing large-scale movements of the population. There are now more than 4 million displaced people in the country. Some of them have settled in the less dangerous areas like here where the hospital is located. To cope with the inflow of people, the team has had to diversify its operations.
We've developed several different activities. The first was an immunization campaign that we did in February for measles and polio vaccinations. We've also been working on water and sanitation activities in the displaced persons camp next to the village where we're working. So we help chlorinate water in the camp, and we've built 50 latrines and 50 showers.
Last February, a team also set up a blood bank to serve the hospitals in the Aleppo region. In May, another MSF hospital was opened in the area. Other projects are in the pipeline, but because of the insecurity and the number of intermediaries involved in the field, it's proving difficult to get them off the ground.
At the start of 2013, between 1,000 and 3,000 Syrians were crossing into Jordan every day. Zaatari camp, 20 kilometers from the border, was opened last July. Since then, more and more tents have appeared. At the beginning of May, there were 100,000 refugees living here. In addition to the traumas of the war, they must cope with the hardships of living in a camp in the middle of the desert. This woman arrived with her 6 children and other family members.
It took us a day and a half to get here because there were lots of checkpoints. Every checkpoint meant an hour's wait. About 30 families left at the same time as us. We've got our passports, but we didn't come through the official border crossing because we heard people were being turned back from there. We had to sneak through like traffickers.
There are currently more than 450,000 refugees living in Jordan. If they keep arriving at the same rate, this figure will be closer to 1 million by the end of 2013. A number of aid organisations are in Zaatari working with the refugees. In March 2013, MSF opened a paediatric hospital here for children aged between 1 month and 10 years old. Many Syrians have settled in and around the Jordanian capital Amman. MSF runs a reconstructive surgery hospital here. Launched in 2006, this program was originally intended for Iraqis injured during the war and with no access to appropriate care in their country. Since the start of the conflict in Syria, injured Syrians are being treated here.
Since the beginning of the year, I think we are facing a major increase. We have more and more Syrians coming. We are, in fact, increasing the number of patients we are taking into the project. We have about 300 patients at any given time, and 1/3 of these patients is Syrian. So we have about 100 patients, surgical patients. Half of them are actually staying in Amman, which is also a new way of treating patients. Most, if not all, our Iraqis and Yemeni patients are staying in our facilities in the rehabilitation center. But Syrians have also coping mechanisms. They have families and they are actually staying in Jordan, but outside our facility.
Many patients were admitted here when they first arrived in Jordan. They've been receiving surgical treatment and post-operative follow-up, as well as physiotherapy sessions and psychosocial support.
There is, because of this terrible war going on there, large increase in the numbers of post-traumatic stress disorders caused by torture in prisons and pressure put on people who are also not involved in any kind of fighting.
This man is alone in Amman. His wife and 7 children have stayed in Zaatari camp. He was injured in the arm last November and is waiting for his 5th operation.
I was asleep with my wife and children. Suddenly there was an explosion just outside the house. Luckily, my children are fine. We had to leave the house, but with God's help, we managed to get to Jordan.
Like this man, hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been forced to flee their homes, often leaving everything behind them. They have no means of subsistence. For the host countries like Jordan, but also Turkey, Lebanon and Iraq, the burden of the refugees and the risks of the conflict spreading are major concerns, and the situation is getting worse by the day.
This is the Yida camp seen from the sky. More than 75,000 Sudanese refugees live here, and humanitarian aid is their only means of survival. MSF has been working in Yida since December 2011, providing medical aid to refugees fleeing the South Kordofan region, where the Sudanese army is fighting the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, or SPLA. The work of humanitarian aid workers is complicated by the constant changes in the number of refugees who arrive in waves that are difficult to plan for. Between May and July 2012, at the height of the rainy season, the camp's population quadrupled, up to 1,000 people arriving daily after many days of walking.
When it rains, we take shelter with our neighbours, but when the rain stops, we go back outside and sleep on the ground.
Flooding made it extremely difficult to get supplies into the camp. The aid organizations hadn't prepared for this crisis. During the summer, the mortality rate was way beyond the emergency threshold. Up to 5 children were dying every day.
The hygiene conditions for the inhabitants of the camp worsened very rapidly. So that means that the access to water, access to to functional latrines was drastically worsened during this period. And this is what we believe is the main cause of the health crisis that our medical team has been dealing with on a daily basis ever since.
The worst of the crisis is now over, but new problems are emerging. The camp is close to zones controlled by the rebels on the other side of the border, so another site has been opened further east to try and relieve the pressure on Yida.
I think the refugees seem not to be willing to move to the new camp for a couple of reasons. One, they're concerned about the security there. That's what they're telling us. Two, their families live here. Also, they've built houses. There are houses now in Yida camp that are built of brick. So the idea of uprooting from this new location after recently uprooting from the Nuba Mountains to move to a new location seems not very attractive to a lot of them.
So Yida remains overcrowded, and the rainy season will soon be back.
There's a serious push now from most actors, including MSF, to prepare in terms of latrines. There's more boreholes going in. Let's hope that there's enough water and sanitation resources available for the people that'll come, because once the rains hit more strongly, I think there's little that can be done.
The shortage of latrines and water points and the generally poor hygiene in the camp are indications that the rainy season will pose serious medical and logistical challenges for the teams again this year. But a good supply of medicines and the construction of a real hospital should help them cope, to some extent at least.
A country split in two. This was the situation in Mali in April 2012. In the south, a fragile government. In the north, armed Islamic groups. MSF's teams arrived in January 2012 and began working at the hospital in Timbuktu in April. They were also supporting the region's health centres.
Dès que les nouveaux maîtres sont arrivés dans la ville de Tombouctou et
As soon as the armed groups arrived in Timbuktu, and indeed across the region, MSF established a dialogue with them to try and ensure the safety of our staff and patients.
Bien sûr, avec l'objectif d'assurer la sécurité de notre personnel et des patients.
Access to healthcare was already difficult in the region before the conflict began, and became increasingly more so by the day.
Il n'y a pas eu des épidémies, on n'a pas pris en charge des milliers de gamins avec.
There weren't any epidemics, but we treated thousands of kids with acute malnutrition. There was clearly a severe lack of health care because of the change in the security situation.
Et il y avait un départ quand même des cadres de certains hôpitaux.
The managers of certain hospitals and health facilities left, and there were problems getting hold of medical supplies, so the health system was seriously disrupted. Our working there was absolutely crucial.
Notre présence était plus que indispensable.
The military intervention by French and Malian troops in January 2013 led to the armed groups' withdrawal from Gao, Kidal and Timbuktu. But the situation has not yet returned to normal. Medical staff are in no hurry to return to the north. Prices have rocketed and security remains of great concern. The 460,000 people displaced within Mali or living as refugees in neighbouring countries have no intention of returning home. And yet they are still living in highly vulnerable conditions. In Mabera in Mauritania, more than 70,000 refugees are living huddled together in the middle of the desert.
Our children are sick and it's hard to find medicine. There aren't enough latrines and we're short of water.
Water, food, medicines and healthcare, especially for the children and pregnant women. The needs are immense and there's not enough aid to go round. A nutrition survey conducted by MSF in November 2012 showed acute malnutrition rates of 17%. In Mabera and also in Niger and Burkina Faso, MSF's teams are providing care for both the local and the refugee population, and they are likely to be needed here for some time to come.
On the 24th of March 2013, after threatening the government for several months, columns of Seleka rebels entered Bangui, prompting the president, François Bozizé, to flee. As the capital fell prey to pillaging and violence, MSF, which has been operating in the Central African Republic for more than 15 years, began treating the wounded.
In March, we began providing surgical support at the community hospital, operating on injuries caused by the coup, so bullet wounds, stabbings, or just the results of beatings. Roughly speaking, around 800 people have been seen in the emergency department so far.
The two other MSF hospitals in Pawa and Kano haven't really suffered from the violence and are still operating normally. But in Bangui, work is constantly jeopardized by the insecurity. MSF's offices and the expatriates' houses have been pillaged, but there's been no physical violence.
La sécurité, que ce soit en Bangui, s'améliore progressivement, mais
the security situation is improving gradually, but it's still risky. There's still sporadic shooting in town every day, and pillaging, but not on the same scale as a month ago. But it's still there anyway, and it's just as dangerous on the roads in the interior of the country as there are rogue Seleka groups taking members of the population or NGOs hostage.
Demeure aussi dangereuse puisqu'il y a des éléments incontrôlés du Seleka qui rançonnent en fait soit la population, soit les ONG.
In mid-April, MSF called on all parties to respect medical personnel and facilities and access to healthcare for patients. Humanitarian aid is already largely insufficient and thousands of people are in need of care.
Au niveau du personnel infirmier ou du personnel de santé du ministère, peu de gens sont vraiment maintenant sur les lieux de travail.
Not many of the Ministry of Health's nursing and medical staff are actually at their posts. There's no access to medicines and medical supplies in the interior of the country. And the rainy season will be back soon, bringing more misery with malnutrition and malaria. And then I honestly don't know what will happen. We're worried about the crisis taking on even bigger proportions in the coming months.
The crisis underway in the Central African Republic is not new. It has been silently eating away at the country for the last 20 years. Long before the events of last December, it was already suffering from a chronic medical emergency. And to make matters worse, people are now flooding out of the country. At the beginning of April, neighboring Chad, which has been taking in refugees since the start of the crisis, saw 10,000 people cross its borders in just a few days. Arriving from the north, they tell tales of villages attacked and burnt to the ground, and family members murdered.
The women in Kanyaruchinya camp sell wood to survive. An armful of branches gathered outside the camp and they'll be able to survive until the next food distribution. It's October 2012 and we are a few miles north of Goma. The M23 rebels have taken control of the zone and forced thousands of people to take to the road.
The M23s threatened us day after day, even during the night. They raped our daughters and wives and beat us men day after day. I've got nothing now. I've got absolutely nothing. I'm living off other people.
A total of almost 500,000 people have been displaced by the conflict since 2012. There isn't enough humanitarian aid coming in and the population is vulnerable.
There's not enough drinking water, and there are no latrines. And there isn't any food for the displaced or for the locals. And the result is the diseases we can see here, cases of malnutrition. We've got cases of respiratory infection. In other words, all the usual epidemic diseases.
For 6 months, up until December, MSF provided primary health care in the camp. It also cared for victims of sexual violence, immunised children against measles and set up a cholera treatment centre. There are also teams working in Rutshuru Hospital.
With the events going on in the region, we've had an increase in surgical activity. When things were at their worst, we were seeing lots of gunshot injuries.
It's hard to predict the endless turns of the conflict. At the end of 2012, Kanyaruchinya camp closed. Then another one opened, this time to the west of Goma. So the MSF teams move on too, alongside the victims of the conflict.
It has become a common sight in Mogadishu. Armed men everywhere, some of them protecting MSF's teams. The coastal capital of Somalia has been reduced to ruins. The situation is improving, but it's a very slow process, and violence is still the daily lot of the people living here.
Le mois d'avril, les militants Shebab ont été repoussés de la ville.
The Al-Shabaab militants were driven out of the town back in April, so that means there's no actual fighting going on. There are also fewer killings, explosive devices, or attacks being perpetrated. But that doesn't mean they've stopped altogether. The situation is still highly volatile, and one of the main risks in Mogadishu today is being in the wrong place at the wrong time and getting caught up in an attack on the AMISOM or the government in power.
D'un attentat qui ciblerait l'AMISOM ou le gouvernement en place.
The MSF hospital in Danile was forced to close for 6 months when it found itself in the middle of a combat zone.
Assalamu alaikum.
Since it reopened in September 2012, 500 surgical interventions have been carried out here.
Donc cet enfant a été amené de Merka.
This child was brought in from Merka after an explosion. So when he arrived, he was unconscious. He has a broken arm and a wound to his leg.
The Horn of Africa was hit by a serious food crisis in 2011. The situation has since improved, but it would take little for the region's health status to deteriorate. Measles and cholera epidemics are a constant threat.
Au cours de l'année 2012, on a travaillé sur 5 sites dans la ville de Mogadishu.
In 2012, we worked on 5 sites in the city of Mogadishu. Then, when new operators arrived to provide outpatient and primary health care, and also because we wanted to reduce the risks to which we were exposing ourselves, we concentrated on Jazeera Hospital. The hospital has about 40 beds. At the end of the year, the maternity unit's activity really took off. At the beginning of 2013, we were doing 6 or 7 deliveries a day in Jazeera.
6-7 accouchements par jour à Jazeera.
2 million Somalis have been forced from their homes by the fighting. Several hundreds of thousands of displaced people are now living in Mogadishu, like here in the Jazeera camp. Elsewhere in the country, vast areas remain inaccessible to aid workers. 2 MSF volunteers, Blanca Thiebaut and Monsterrat Serra, are still being detained somewhere in Somalia, more than 20 months after being kidnapped in Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya. MSF is calling for their immediate and unconditional release.
Yours is found in a number of African countries, including the Congo and its neighbours, the Central African Republic and Cameroon. It affects both men and women, but children are the most at risk.
Team briefing in Betu, in the northeast of Congo-Brazzaville. 30 or so people are about to spend a month in the tropical forest seeking out the Aka Pygmy communities. Aka Pygmies are particularly vulnerable to yaws. This infectious disease causes skin lesions before attacking bones and cartilage. Long neglected, it is non-fatal but highly disabling.
Cette maladie bactérienne, en fait, touche principalement des milieux défavorisés.
This bacterial disease mainly affects poor communities. There is a simple means of eradicating it with a single dose of azithromycin, a very effective drug, very well tolerated, a drug that's been used for a long time, that's safe and that would enable us to eradicate this disease in a population that is usually difficult for the different health services to reach.
Qui permet justement d'éradiquer cette maladie chez une population qui est difficilement accessible d'habitude par les différents services de santé.
The Aka Pygmies are indeed very isolated. Ostracized by the Congolese government, they live in remote villages hard to access. But MSF decided to supply the whole Aka population, estimated at almost 20,000, with azithromycin to be rid of the disease once and for all.
C'est pour ça qu'on a développé une stratégie assez lourde.
So it's taken some serious organising in terms of logistics, teams and material. And we have taken our time and go from village to treat patients.
Pour traiter tous les patients.
Which means using varied forms of transport. Travelling by car, dugout canoes or on foot, the 3 teams managed to treat almost 17,500 people on their first tour. 3 months later, the teams returned to the worst affected areas to be sure that everyone had received a dose of the antibiotic, the only way of eradicating the disease completely. An additional 5,000 people were treated on this second visit. The final stage, spreading the word. MSF's aim is to show that this experience can be reproduced wherever yours is still present, even in the most isolated regions. So part of the team headed off to the World Health Organization to share the lessons learned from this campaign. In the Congo, it is now up to the Ministry of Health to take over this project. MSF, meanwhile, is thinking of repeating this experience in other countries.
In 2012, during a humanitarian intervention on an unprecedented scale, more than 900,000 children living in the Sahel were treated for severe malnutrition. MSF treated 30,000 severely malnourished children in Niger, Chad, Mauritania and Burkina Faso through its regular programs and emergency interventions. Everything points to 2013 being another difficult year for the children of the Sahel. The crisis here is unremitting, only its intensity varies.
For how many years running are we going to keep talking about crises in the Sahel? For how many years are we going to keep on doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome? I think it's time we tried something else. We know for sure that every year during the rainy season, children are going to arrive in the health centres emaciated and suffering from malaria. We should be developing much more comprehensive approaches ahead of this happening.
So MSF set up a comprehensive healthcare project in the south of Mali, which focuses on both prevention and treatment of the main deadly diseases in children under 2.
When we supply the Plumpy-Dose food supplement, a mosquito net and vaccinations, children are in very good health by the time they reach 2. And can continue their development without any major concerns.
The program was run here in the Consegela Health District. By December 2012, 2,000 children had reached age 2 and completed follow-up with MSF.
I give my child 2 spoonfuls of the supplement every day, and in the week, I also give him rich meals with egg or something similar. With the supplement, this is really good for him. It's making him strong. He doesn't get as many fevers, has fewer minor illnesses, and he walked really early. I've noticed that with the supplement.
In the south of Mali, 1 in 5 children dies before their 5th birthday. Since the start of this project, the child mortality rate in Consegela has decreased. So has chronic malnutrition. This comprehensive management of child health is a first for MSF, and in light of the results, the experience looks set to be repeated.
In Mali, it's the same scenario every summer. The rainy season arrives, equaling more outbreaks of malaria and more children dying. But in 2012, 3 letters were enough to change the outcome of this equation. And these letters were SMC, for seasonal malaria chemoprevention.
Until now, when children had malaria, we could only treat them once they were ill. But this year, we've started doing preventive treatment. So during the rainy season, the season with the most malaria, we've been giving them a course of treatment at the beginning of each month to stop them contracting the disease.
For 3 months, the teams distributed preventive treatment to 170,000 children in Chad and Mali. Ami Diabate, who lives in the district of Koutiala in Mali, is one of the beneficiaries.
My children used to get fevers all the time. Since they've started taking these medicines, they've had almost none.
Each tablet protects a child for 1 month. In these regions where malaria is endemic, the effects of the distributions were immediate.
Le constat effectué au niveau des structures de santé périphériques.
We're really very satisfied with the results, both in the peripheral health centres and at the hospital. There's been a significant reduction in the number of cases in the 3 to 59 months age group. And the number of cases of simple and severe malaria has been more than halved, and mortality is following the same trend everywhere.
de façon systématique ou bien de façon identique cette tendance.
SMC won't be able to eradicate malaria on its own, but it is an effective means of controlling the disease. Overall, the number of cases of simple and complicated malaria has been reduced by 70% in MSF's centres. This strategy will be repeated in Mali and Chad in 2013. The teams will use this opportunity to learn more about its impact and limits.
I'm standing in front of the Supreme Court. Novartis's appeal was dismissed. It basically means that medicines will continue to be produced in India. This is really a big win.
New Delhi, 1st of April 2013. Médicos Sem Fronteiras is celebrating the end of a battle that began 7 years ago.
Novartis has taken the step of challenging a key health safeguard in the Indian patent law. If that safeguard goes, many drugs will get patented, and it essentially means many essential drugs will go off production from India.
The production of generic medicines. This is what was at stake in the legal battle that began in 2006. And the disputed issue is a mechanism known as evergreening. Evergreening is a tactic used by the big laboratories to renew their drug patents after 20 years.
When the patent ends, other producers can come in and compete with each other, and bingo, the prices come tumbling down. So the medicines become affordable for everyone. But the drug companies want more profit. So they make a tiny little change to their drugs and ask for another 20-year patent. Evergreening.
India, as it happens, is a producer of generic medicines, and it intends to defend itself against practices such as evergreening. This is where Article 3D of the Indian Patent Act comes in.
It prevents companies from filing lots of trivial modifications to existing medicines to extend the monopoly term beyond 20 years, which thereby keeps affordable generic medicines off the market in India and in developing countries around the world.
Industrialists don't like Article 3D, and this is how the Novartis case started back in 2006.
The story with Novartis's medicine Gleevec, which was a medicine in dispute in India, actually is a medicine that was first introduced in the 1990s. But Novartis did not apply for a patent in India until 2005. Now, because Novartis's patent application in India was the very thing which Section 3D seeks to prevent, which are these tiny modifications of existing medicines, the Indian patent system basically said it did not deserve a patent. And so began the dispute over India's Section 3D.
Novartis refused to capitulate, and the Gleevec case became the first round in a long fight.
When Novartis lost its original court decision in India before its patent court, it decided it disagreed with the judgment, and it decided to appeal to the High Court or to the Superior Court in Madras. And at this point is when the Indian government and civil society groups started to become concerned. When the Madras court system, like the Indian patent system before, decided that Novartis did not deserve a patent on this medicine, it did not stop. It started to create pressure before the Indian government, in the Indian media, and it also then filed a court case in the Indian Superior Court. When Novartis also failed in the Superior Court, it then went to the Indian Supreme Court.
Meanwhile, MSF scaled up its mobilization to alert public opinion. Demonstrations, flash mobs, street art. As this legal action was nothing less than an attempt to change the interpretation of the law, blur its lines, basically render it devoid of all substance.
India is the pharmacy of the developing world, and for Médicos Sem Fronteiras, for governments and for donor agencies around the world, the availability of low-cost medicines and vaccines is critical towards providing treatment to patients around the world. If Novartis had succeeded in its case before in India, it would have meant that low-cost medicines would have been delayed for longer periods of time, and for the people that we seek to treat every day, they would have had to have waited longer and would have suffered longer and would have died from the diseases that we know that we can treat today.
But on the 1st of April, the verdict came in and Novartis's claim was dismissed. For MSF and for all the parties involved, but especially for all the patients in developing countries, it's a victory. However, production of generic medicines remains under threat, but the immediate danger has passed.
At at last some good news on the tuberculosis front. After several decades without the slightest innovation, doctors now have access to new diagnosis and therapeutic tools. First, a new test, Gene Expert, that speeds up the diagnosis and shows whether the patient is suffering from a resistant form of the disease. And then, since the start of 2013, a new drug.
Our new drug, bedaquiline, has been provisionally registered for treatment of drug-resistant tuberculosis patients. As the drug is still under the clinical evaluation stage or still under investigation, it can be only used in a compassionate use mechanism. That means it can be used by patients who have no other options for treatment before it becomes available on the market.
In 2010, MSF treated more than 30,000 people with tuberculosis. Every day, the teams have countless obstacles to overcome. They first have to diagnose the patient, which can prove complicated in certain cases, in children, for example. Then there's the care. For patients suffering from resistant tuberculosis, the treatment will be long, painful and difficult to adhere to, with no guarantee of success. If it fails, there are no options left other than bedaquiline, which now can be incorporated into a new protocol.
Many has managed to put in place the necessary regulations and mechanisms for compassionate use, and together with MSF have had approval for 8 patients from the drug company, 6 of which are already under treatment. These patients are patients who have all experienced failure of the regular treatment of drug-resistant tuberculosis. That means they've subdued years of injectable treatments, multiple drugs, side effects, and it hasn't worked for them. So it's really a last chance for these patients.
But bedaquiline is no miracle solution.
This is only a small step. We don't know a lot about this drug. We don't know about its efficiency or its side effects. In addition, we need a lot more than one drug.
But however limited, this progress could be the precursor to a major breakthrough in the treatment of tuberculosis.
There are other drugs in the pipeline, and we could hope in the next few years there'll be some studies putting these drugs together to make a new regimen for drug-resistant tuberculosis. One with less side effects, one that's shorter, cheaper, and that works better. Like that, we'll be able to scale up the use of a new regimen and more people can have access to it.
The World Health Organization estimates the number of new multi-resistant tuberculosis cases each year to be 450,000. Yet only a tiny proportion of patients are receiving appropriate care. So for medical teams, accessibility to new treatments is a matter of real urgency.
Last December, Médicos Sem Fronteiras, the DNDi and the Mount Sinai School of Medicine came together to discuss medical innovations. The aim was to review research conducted into neglected diseases over the last 10 years or so.
There's been a slight increase in the amount of research, most of it in malaria and diarrheal diseases. But tropical diseases such as leishmaniasis, sleeping sickness and scores of others are still massively neglected.
Between 2000 and 2011, MSF took part in developing a number of innovations, supported others and has put many into use.
We started looking into the state of pharmaceutical research in so-called neglected diseases, a group of 50 or so infectious and parasitic diseases, because at the end of the 90s we simply had nothing left to treat them with. We'd reached a dead end. For sleeping sickness, for example, we were still using arsenic derivatives, despite the fact that they were much less effective in killing the parasite and still just as toxic for the patients, killing 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 depending on the series. So in many situations we were unable to do our job properly.
Among the innovations already used on MSF projects or being awaited impatiently by the teams is the new meningitis vaccine. A new viral load test for AIDS patients is also being developed, as well as new treatments for people suffering from sleeping sickness or Chagas disease. So we can stop using the old ones, which are not just ineffective, but also toxic. And there is still a huge amount of new ground to cover.
Quand on a regardé sur le plan qualitatif, ce groupe cinquantaine de maladies,
When we started looking at this group of 50 or so diseases from a qualitative angle, we saw that for a very small number, 16%, the situation was pretty much covered by what we already had, what had come out recently. But for half of the diseases, this is absolutely not the case. There's still a serious lack of quality drugs for prevention or treatment, and sometimes for both. And for more than 25% of the diseases, there's nothing at all.
However, innovation is not confined to the laboratories. Pending the discovery of miracle cures, the teams in the field are adapting protocols, reorganizing care, and giving old habits a facelift.
For example, when we decide to simplify the way certain types of care are administered, like we did for HIV patients, by cutting down on biological follow-up, using nurses instead of doctors in a certain number of situations, focusing our efforts on the transfer of knowledge to patients by means of what we call counselling. All this is medical innovation, and it has a very, very significant impact. If there are now millions and millions of patients on antiretroviral treatments for HIV, it's because we've introduced changes in how we organise care. If we'd stuck with the initial forms of organisation, we would never have reached the 8 to 10 million mark that we're approaching today.
What is still lacking is revolutionary tools. Vaccines that dispense with the cold chain and the need for injections. Reliable rapid tests that can be used in difficult settings. Ambitious treatments for drug-resistant diseases, including tuberculosis. At the end of this first decade of innovations, there are still a lot of questions waiting for an answer. But then, 10 years is nothing in pharmaceutical research terms.